This video is sponsored by Scentbird. More on them a little later. On a spring morning in late March of 2006, detectives with Ohio's Bureau of Criminal Investigation received an important phone call. It came from an employee at a storage and moving company in Fairfield County, who said that he wanted to talk to them about a strange interaction he'd had with a couple of customers about a week earlier. Specifically, about a man and woman who had rented a truck from the business where he worked, and who told him that they were moving across the country. The man would go on to describe several things about that encounter, which after some thinking he said he now viewed as red flags. Detectives agreed, though what they didn't know was that things were about to get a whole lot more interesting. When they asked the employee for the names of the two customers, they immediately realized that they knew who this man and woman were. You see, at that moment, they were in the middle of investigating a brutal double homicide. And with this phone call, it looked like they now had the final piece that they needed to solve the case.
What is your emergency? I think my mom might have been killed. What you got going on there? I just came in, looks like there's a break-in. I just peeked around the corner of my mom's bedroom and she's laying on the floor. And it looks like there's blood on the floor. Okay. Really? Okay. Oh, no. Anybody else in the residence? I don't know. Nobody that I know of. I heard my mom's dog barking downstairs. What's your name? Jeremy Moore.
The 911 call that you just heard was placed a few minutes before 9 a.m. on March 13th, 2006. It was made by a 27-year-old man named Jeremy Moore, who stated that he had been unable to reach his mother and stepfather, Karen and Jim Divelbliss, that morning. After heading over to their house to check on them, he found the place eerily quiet. He had ventured as far inside as the master bedroom before making an awful discovery. From around the corner, he could see what looked like his mother's body lying motionless on the floor. Surrounding it was a large pool of blood. In a panic, Jeremy had run from the house and had immediately called for help. When officers from the Fairfield County Sheriff's Office arrived minutes later, the first thing they did was conduct a sweep of the house. The two-story, stone-veneered residence, located just north of the city of Lancaster, was quite large, and police wanted to make sure there were no safety threats inside. This was actually something that Jeremy had brought up during his 911 call, explaining that he had fled the house because he was worried that whoever had hurt his mother might still be in there. After going room to room, police were able to determine that there was no present danger inside the home. However, what they did find during their search was nothing short of horrifying. In the master bedroom, just as Jeremy had described, officers found his mother, 50-year-old Karen Divelbliss, dead on the floor. Judging by the amount of blood present, she had been the victim of a vicious attack. Sadly, she wasn't the only one. On the complete opposite side of the house, police found the body of Karen's husband, Jeremy's stepfather, 71-year-old Jim Divelbliss. He was lying on his back on a section of tile floor in the basement, also in a large pool of blood. It was clear that both he and Karen had been murdered. When detectives arrived at the scene and had a closer look at the bodies, they noticed that Karen and Jim had similar injuries that had come from a knife or some other kind of bladed weapon. An autopsy would soon confirm this, revealing the full brutality of the attacks. Jim had suffered 39 stab wounds, while Karen had been stabbed a staggering 83 times. Tragically, both of them had put up a fight, with Karen in particular sustaining numerous defensive wounds to her hands. The autopsy also revealed another important detail. Karen and Jim had likely been dead for several days by the time they were found. While the disturbing nature of the killings was the first thing that stuck out to investigators, other details also quickly caught their attention. Both of the rooms where the victims had been found were in a serious state of disarray and appeared to have been ransacked. In the master bedroom, clothes and other items were scattered everywhere. Drawers and cupboards were left open, with some having been pulled out entirely, their contents dumped onto the bed and the floor. A large jewelry box belonging to Karen seemed to be in particularly rough shape. All of its little drawers and shelves had been ripped out and rifled through, with nothing of significant value seemingly spared. Whoever was responsible had even gone as far as to remove the wedding band from Karen's hand. In both rooms, though, it appeared that the main area of focus had been a safe. There was one in the closet of the master bedroom and another in a basement closet close to where Jim had been found. Both of these safes had been cleaned out. Taking all of this into account, robbery seemed to be the most straightforward motive behind the double murder. And given how far apart Karen and Jim were found inside the house, detectives speculated that it was likely more than one person was responsible. That being the case, the obvious question was who could carry out such a heinous crime? Investigators weren't sure. However, there were a couple final clues at the scene that they felt might hint at a possible answer. There were no signs of forced entry at the house, and when Jeremy arrived that morning, the front door to the residence was unlocked. Lastly, the alarm for the home security system had never been tripped or activated. To detectives, all of this had an incredibly dark implication. Specifically, that the Divelblisses knew their killers and had willingly invited them into their home. If that was true, then the next step in the case was clear. Authorities needed to learn as much as they could about Jim and Karen, as well as the people that they were closest to. After conducting a preliminary examination of the scene, Fairfield County detectives began interviewing friends and family members of Karen and Jim Divelbliss. Through these conversations, they were hoping to collect as much information about the lives of the victims as possible, as well as suss out anyone with a potential motive. Due to the serious nature of the crime, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, otherwise known as the BCI, was brought in to assist. Understandably, the first person that authorities spoke with was Jeremy Moore, since he was the one that had alerted them to what had happened. The 27-year-old was still incredibly shaken up by what he had seen, though he did his best to answer detectives' questions and give a full accounting of everything that had happened prior to the 911 call. Jeremy explained that he had last seen his mother and stepfather 4 days earlier, on March 9th. His parents had just returned from a short vacation to Las Vegas, but he said as far as he knew, they were supposed to be heading to the local bowling alley that night for a tournament. On Monday morning, Jeremy said that he turned up early at the family business, a retail store in Lancaster called D&D Sales. He started his usual opening routine, but to his surprise, neither his mother nor Jim showed up. Jeremy said that when he called the house and there was no answer, he started to get concerned. He asked his grandfather, Karen's stepfather, Gordon Hammond, to look after the store for a bit because he wanted to go and check in to make sure everything was okay. Things had quickly taken a chilling turn from there.
When did you see your mom, Karen, and stepdad last? Thursday, roughly between 7 and 9, after, I think they were on their way to go to their bowling tournament. Why don't you tell me what took place this morning? We own a business, D&D Sales, and I usually open, and I called her. I always call her first thing in the morning since I get there. And I called, and nobody answered. Told my grandfather to watch the store, and I was going to run out to their home. Walked up to the front door, and went to open it, and it was unlocked, and I opened the door. The house looked a little ransacked. I stopped and peeked into the bedroom, and that's when I noticed my mom's feet and from about her shoulders down, and blood laying on the floor. Then I got nervous because I was afraid maybe somebody was downstairs, so I ran out the front door into the driveway, to the end of the driveway, and called 911.
Going off their working theory so far, detectives asked Jeremy if he knew of anything specifically in his parents' house that was valuable and that might be missing. Jeremy mentioned his mom's jewelry, but said that he didn't know where she kept most of it. When asked directly, he also said that he didn't know who was responsible for the murders.
Tell me something in your parents' house that you know is pretty valuable that you think might be missing that we can look for. She would have jewelry, but I don't know where. You know who killed your mother and stepfather? No.
After speaking with several other people, Detectives were able to confirm most of Jeremy's story. Karen and Jim had been on a trip to Las Vegas, and longtime friends of theirs at the local Tiki Lanes bowling alley said that they had seen them there on the night of March 9th. According to these friends, Jim and Karen were involved in a couple of different leagues and were usually at the bowling alley 2 or 3 times a week. That evening was no different. Karen and Jim said that they were tired from their trip, but otherwise appeared to be their usual selves and were in good spirits. Likewise, many people mentioned that they were aware that the Divelblisses kept a lot of money and valuables at their house. Since Jim regularly attended auctions to purchase inventory and wholesale items for their business, he was well known for keeping large amounts of cash on hand. Karen also had a large collection of jewelry. She was especially fond of rings and usually wore several at a time. This meant that it was likely whoever had killed Karen had actually taken a number of rings off her fingers after killing her, not just her wedding band. The rings were also fairly unique and were mostly purchased from the same jeweler in Lancaster. A woman who worked at the store, Irene Moss, told investigators that she would almost certainly recognize Karen's rings if they were recovered. When it came to who could have actually committed the crime, initially, most of those detectives spoke to were at a loss. They said that Karen and Jim were extremely well liked in Lancaster and had done a lot for those in the community. Unfortunately, when we did the research for this video, there wasn't a ton of information available about Karen and Jim's early lives. That being said, here's what we were able to find. Karen and Jim both grew up in the Lancaster, Ohio area and had been married prior to meeting. Jim had 5 kids from his first relationship, while Jeremy was Karen's only child. Considering the roughly 20-year age gap between them, it seems that most of Jim's kids were adults by the time that he and Karen got together. Jeremy, though, was still pretty young, and it appears that Jim was around for a good chunk of his life. Before their marriage, Karen and Jim each had fairly normal jobs. Karen reportedly worked for the Drew Shoe Company for 18 years, while Jim worked for the Stuck Mold Co. for 25 years. While it's hard to say what the couple's financial situations each looked like before they started their relationship, by all accounts, after they opened up D&D sales together, they were living a comfortable life. The business was doing well, and in addition to their sizable home, they purchased several rental properties in the area. According to those that knew the Divelblisses, the success of D&D sales was truly a team effort. Karen was incredibly personable and had a way with customers, especially when it came to knowing who needed a little bit of extra help. Lancaster wasn't a particularly wealthy area, but the Divelblisses made sure that their business was one that locals could actually afford to shop at. On top of this, the couple were known for giving generous discounts to people who they knew were going through a rough time. Because of this, D&D sales became a staple of the community, the kind of place where almost everyone had shopped at least once or twice. With Karen holding down the front end of the business, Jim focused more of his attention on making sure their store was always stocked with new items. Apparently, business was something Jim had always excelled at. In an interview, his brother Philip called him the smart one of their siblings, saying that everyone else in the family always looked up to him. While he was naturally on the quieter side, Jim was also friendly and was known for his playful sense of humor. As for the relationship between Karen and Jim, everyone said that it was a good one. Anyone who spent a significant amount of time around them could tell that they were very much in love. This was especially true of Jim. As one of Karen's siblings put it, quote, "He cherished the ground that she walked on." It was for these reasons and more that when detectives started asking around about who actually could have wanted to harm the Divelblisses, that most people didn't have a clue. Not only did the couple not have any obvious enemies, they had gone out of their way to help many people in the community. Whether that was the previously mentioned generosity at their business, working out deals with tenants at their properties who were having trouble paying rent, or hiring locals to do odd jobs for them when they knew they were struggling to make ends meet. However, this wasn't to say that there were no suspects. In fact, within just a few hours of the murders being discovered, detectives would be handed a pair of equally plausible leads. While these leads would send them in 2 completely different directions, both of them seemed to confirm what they had initially feared. The truth about what had happened to Karen and Jim was far closer to home than anyone wanted to admit. Summer is just around the corner, and for me, that can mean only one thing: being slowly boiled alive in my own juices while the hot weather progressively turns the Crime Zone studio into a literal sweatbox. Fortunately, while this room may feel like a swamp for the next 90 days, it won't have to smell like one, thanks to today's sponsor, Scentbird. Scentbird is an awesome perfume and cologne subscription service, one that allows you to explore and try out new fragrances. They offer more than 700 options from designer brands that you already know, like Gucci, Prada, and Versace, as well as hidden gems that you might not be aware of. When you first sign up, Scentbird gets you to do a short quiz, which they then use to make tailored suggestions and steer you in the right direction. The best part by far, though, is the price. Scentbird makes it really affordable to try a bunch of different fragrances, and their flexible plans and hassle-free cancellation make the process really smooth and risk-free. This month, Scentbird was kind enough to send over 3 different options for me to test out. As you can see, we've got Avant Quintessence, Icon Ice, and Kinetic by Toomey. Of the 3, I'd say that Kinetic is probably my favorite. I'm a big fan of sandalwood, and I feel like that really comes through with this one. Icon Ice was a close second though, because I also really like the notes of cedar and bergamot in it. As you can see, the amount in each bottle is pretty generous, and I also really like the design of the bottles themselves. Now, as I mentioned before, Scentbird always tries to keep affordability at the forefront of what they do, but for a limited time they've made the deal even sweeter for subscribers of our channel. If you head over to their website after the video and use our code CRIMEZONE at checkout, you'll get 55% off your first month. That means you can try Scentbird today for a little over $7 US. You can find a link to that in the description below, as well as to the specific fragrances that I just mentioned. Thanks, Scentbird. While most of the people the detectives initially spoke with about Karen and Jim Divelbliss's murders were at a loss as to who might be responsible, as hours passed and news of the terrible crime began to spread across Lancaster, more and more people appeared to be willing to speculate. Rumors started to swirl, ones that quickly zeroed in on one potential culprit in particular: Karen and Jim's son, Jeremy Moore. Although Jeremy had been the one to discover the crime scene, many wondered if this was simply a cover. After all, he was an obvious suspect with an even more obvious motive. Jeremy would have both had access to his parents' house and would have known his way around there. With them out of the way, he also stood to receive a sizable inheritance. Of course, this was something that authorities had immediately considered themselves. While Jeremy had a solid alibi for the morning that Jim and Karen's bodies were discovered, based on the autopsies and the witness statements detectives collected, it was likely the actual crime had taken place on the night of March 9th, when they were last seen alive. For this period of time, Jeremy's alibi was a lot less concrete. In fact, most of it relied solely on statements from his wife, Jody Graff. Investigators became a lot more interested in the possibility of Jeremy's involvement in the crime, however, when they received a call from one of Karen's friends, who said that she had some potentially relevant information for them. The friend explained that Karen had previously confided in her that Jeremy would sometimes take things from her without permission, and that he relied on her a lot for financial support. When authorities spoke with other family members, they backed this up. They said that when Jeremy was younger, he had been really helpful at the family store. However, as he had gotten older, his life had gotten more and more troubled, including run-ins with the law. These incidents had all been non-violent and were mostly misdemeanor thefts, though given that robbery appeared to be the primary motive behind Karen and Jim's deaths, police couldn't help but wonder if all of this was related. All that said, many family members told detectives that they seriously doubted Jeremy was capable of something like this. Yes, his behavior had occasionally caused tensions in the family, but for the most part, Jeremy was trying his best to be a good son. They also said that he loved and idolized his mother. After hearing all of this, police weren't sure what to think. They didn't have any solid evidence connecting Jeremy to the crime, but they also couldn't rule him out either. For the meantime, He remained a person of interest while they moved on to a second lead that had also come in by this point. This second lead was from one of Karen's brothers, Edgar Smith. Edgar said that after hearing about his sister's murder, a disturbing thought had almost immediately crept into his mind. It was concerning his estranged wife, Deanna Smith. Edgar explained that a few years back, he and his family had moved to Pennsylvania for work. At some point, they had decided to return to Ohio. No sooner had he and Deanna started looking for housing than Karen offered them a place to live. Being the generous person that she was, she offered them one of her and Jim's rental properties, telling Edgar just to pay them what they could afford. Unfortunately, not long after moving back to Ohio, Edgar and Deanna's marriage had started to fall apart. When they decided to get divorced, Edgar ended up moving out, feeling it was better for Deanna and their sons to stay in the house. After Edgar was no longer living at the property, Karen had worked out a new deal with Deanna in terms of the living situation. Since Deanna couldn't afford much at all in the way of rent, they agreed that she would come and clean Karen and Jim's house once a week. At first, this seemed like a very convenient arrangement. Deanna didn't have to worry about having a place to live, and it was super helpful for Karen and Jim because they put so many hours into their business that they were barely ever home. However, Edgar said that a little while ago, he had gotten a call from his sister, who told him that Deanna wasn't holding up her end of the deal. She had stopped coming to clean, and Karen was getting a little bit annoyed. Edgar said he was caught off guard because apparently this had been happening for some time. Karen said she wasn't sure what to do. Now, Edgar said that he really didn't want to believe that Deanna could be responsible for something as terrible as a double murder. Still, he was aware that Deanna had always been kind of jealous of his sister. Karen had all these nice things in this big house, and meanwhile, they had always kind of struggled. What was especially unsettling to Edgar, though, was that he knew that in particular, Deanna had always really been fond of Karen's jewelry. Needless to say, detectives were intrigued by the information that Edgar provided, especially since they figured that if Deanna had been cleaning for Karen and Jim, it likely meant that she had a key to their house. With that, they decided to bring her in for an interview. During questioning, investigators asked Deanna Smith about her relationship with Karen and asked her to provide further details about the rental arrangement that Edgar had described. Deanna said that the situation was normal for the most part, though claimed she hadn't had much contact with Karen lately because of the divorce with Edgar.
Karen and Jim, do they actually own the home that you're in?
Yes.
Did you pay them some sort of rent or
Yes.
what was your rent?
$650. She raised it to $650. I cleaned for her also.
So when you quit cleaning for her, you guys left parted on good terms?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't have a lot of contact because of the divorce.
When asked about whether she still had a key to the Divelbliss' house, Deanna claimed she wasn't sure. But either way, she said that she didn't know the security code for the home security system.
You still have keys to their home?
I don't know if I do or not, to be honest with you. I would have to look. I don't think so. I didn't know the security code.
Understandably, this last bit piqued the attention of detectives. Although, with no concrete evidence against Deanna, authorities were forced to keep looking elsewhere. They turned their attention to the other rental properties the Divelblisses owned, speculating that perhaps another tenant might have had an issue with Karen and Jim. Unfortunately, this was another dead end. Just when it looked like the investigation might be stalling, however, detectives received another massive lead. It came from a local pawn shop, which reported that they had just purchased a sizable amount of jewelry. When police heard the name on the pawn slip, they sprung into action. The person who had sold the items was Deanna Smith. From the moment that Fairfield County detectives learned that a large amount of jewelry had been stolen from Karen and Jim Divelbliss' home, one of the techniques they had used to try and solve the case was to reach out to as many local pawn shops in the area as possible to see if they had recently made any suspicious purchases. A couple of days into the investigation, it seemed like this had finally paid off when they received a call from the owner of a shop in Lancaster called A&A Pawn. The owner there told authorities that he might have what they were looking for. The man explained that on March 11th, So, 2 days after the Divelblisses were killed, but 2 days before their bodies were found, a woman had come into his store looking to sell some jewelry. When the owner checked it out, he could tell that it was high-end stuff, and he immediately made an offer, which the woman seemed eager to accept. After hearing about the murders, though, he now worried that he might have unwittingly come face-to-face with the perpetrator. He showed detectives the pawn slip and surveillance video, which confirmed that the woman he had done business with was indeed Deanna Smith. After obtaining a warrant for all of the pieces that had been sold, authorities took the items to the Divelblisses' jeweler, Irene Moss. They also showed pictures of the jewelry to Karen and Jim's friends and family. What happened next is actually pretty insane. It turned out that while some of these pieces of jewelry had belonged to Karen at one point in time, none of the items that had been sold at A&A Pawn were things that had been stolen from the house. Instead, these were actually pieces that Karen had given to Deanna several years earlier. In short, Deanna Smith was completely innocent. She had just chosen to sell some jewelry for extra cash at the worst possible time. The whole thing was a massive coincidence. Understandably, this was pretty frustrating for detectives who had just watched their best lead yet completely fall apart. Luckily, though, things were about to take another turn. On March 19th, so 6 days into the investigation, Fairfield County investigators were contacted by a man named Tony Luttrell. Tony was someone that authorities were fairly familiar with. He had a lengthy criminal record that involved several burglaries. His father was also an electrician who had worked for Karen and Jim at some of their rental houses. Tony often helped his dad with these jobs, so he had actually been to many of these properties himself. However, as detectives were about to find out, this was not his only connection to the case. After calling up detectives, Tony explained that he had information. He said that he was pretty sure he knew the people who were responsible for Karen and Jim's murders. During a subsequent interview, Tony said that he had recently been at a party in the area where a bunch of people were drinking and doing drugs together. At some point during the evening, he had been roped into a conversation with several others there. The group was talking about committing a burglary, one that was targeting Karen and Jim Divelbliss. While multiple people had been involved in that conversation, Tony stated that it was really just two people who were pushing everything and who seemed serious about it. Their names were Eric Hockman and Heidi Kidwell. Tony said that Eric and Heidi wanted to rob Karen and Jim because they needed money and because Eric felt that the Divelblisses owed him.
Someone said he knew there was cash out there in the house, and he said he knew it was in my bedroom, around the bed, on bed, something about a bed.
What residence are we speaking of?
Karen and Jim Divelbliss. Basically, the other day when they planned to go to burglarize this house, you know.
So we said they had money. Do you know how much money they have?
Well, no, I didn't
Make any mention there?
told me it was like $25,000. That's all I heard.
Who participated in the majority of that conversation?
Mostly Eric and Heidi.
Tony said he wasn't sure what had happened after that. He claimed that he was adamant that he wanted no part in the plan. After all, he already had legal troubles of his own to worry about. He was able to provide police with a potential motive, though. Like many others, Tony said Eric was one of those who had been hired by the Divelblisses to do odd jobs. Eric was angry at the couple, claiming that Karen had stiffed him on payment for some work that he'd completed.
Who brought the conversation about hitting a leg?
Karen did. So they asked me about it to be something I'd be interested in. And I explained to them the reasons why I wouldn't be interested in that. They probably have an alarm system, and their neighbors veered off the conversation because I didn't want nothing to do with it.
They talk about what they do if somebody was home.
No. I know Eric, he would know when they was home or not home, so he did a lot of work for me. He was mad because she didn't pay him the money. He was pushing about that.
While detectives initially weren't sure if they could trust Tony, when they started asking around about Eric Hockman, several people who were close to the Divelblisses were able to verify some of the details of his story. Eric had done odd jobs for Karen and Jim, including painting the sign for D&D sales. Where the stories started to differ, though, was in how Eric had characterized his dispute with the Divelblisses. Karen had never refused to pay him. Instead, Eric had stopped finishing the work she gave him. Even after that, she had agreed to give him additional jobs when he came back to her asking for more money. With it now seeming very possible that Eric and Heidi were behind Karen and Jim's murders, detectives turned their attention to trying to track them down. There was just one problem. No one had actually seen the couple in several days. Fortunately, that was about to change when investigators caught one final lucky break. Just a heads up, the timeline is a little fuzzy on this next part. In our research, the sources we came across completely contradicted each other. As a result, we've done our best to kind of read between the lines here, but just for the sake of full disclosure, there's definitely a possibility that we could be wrong. I'll explain more as we get into it. So, on March 26th, 11 days into the investigation, Fairfield County detectives received a call from a man named Patrick Heim. This is the call that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Patrick was an employee at a local storage and moving company called A1 Self Storage, and he told police that he had recently had a strange interaction with a pair of customers. Patrick explained that when he arrived at work that morning, he found a man and woman waiting there for him. It was still about half an hour before the business was about to open, but the couple asked him if he would please help them early. They looked tired and quite disheveled, so Patrick took pity on them and agreed. After heading inside to the main counter, the man and woman explained that they were moving across the country. They wanted to rent a moving truck, asking if there were any locations where they could return the vehicle in southern Florida. Patrick said that there were, and gave them a quote. The couple immediately agreed, then requested to pay in cash. Patrick said they proceeded to pull out a plastic shopping bag that was absolutely stuffed with money. It was easily more cash than Patrick said he'd ever seen in one place. Once the man and woman got the keys, they were on their way. So, this is where the fuzziness with the timeline comes in. According to some sources we came across, Patrick called police the same day that this whole thing happened, which is listed as March 26th. However, some of these same sources state that the day the truck was rented was just a couple of days after Jim and Karen's bodies were discovered, so on or around March 15th. Obviously, both of these things can't be true. Personally, it seems to us like the truck rental date was the 15th, but Patrick didn't call until March 26th after he had some time to think about the strange interaction. This is because we came across other sources that claim the truck was turned in southern Florida around March 18th, which seems to line up with the earlier rental date. Again, we could be wrong, so that's why we're letting you know. Anyway, what no one disagrees with was the names of the people who had rented the moving truck. Patrick told detectives that it was Eric Hockman and Heidi Kidwell. Thanks to this massive lead, and after a few more days of searching, authorities were able to track Eric and Heidi down to a property in Key Largo, Florida. Using what they had uncovered so far, they were able to obtain a search warrant. On April 4th, 2006, they executed that search warrant. Inside was a treasure trove of evidence. Not only did detectives find $40,000 in stolen cash and coins hidden inside the residence, they also found a large amount of jewelry. Jewelry which would soon be confirmed to have been stolen from the Divelblisses' home. Disturbingly, traces of Karen's blood was still on some of these items when they were recovered. Following Eric and Heidi's arrests, both of them eventually agreed to confess. Heidi was the first to crack, admitting that she and Eric had traveled to Karen and Jim's house on the night of March 9th, armed with knives.
Either of you have a weapon on you when you went there?
Yeah, a knife.
Eric offered extensive details about the crime, confirming a lot of what Tony had previously told police. However, he said that he always knew that they were going to have to commit the crime while the Divelblisses were home because of their security system. On March 9th, they had waited until Karen and Jim came home from bowling, then pulled into their driveway as they were heading into the house. He said that he wanted to talk, and the Divelblisses had let him and Heidi inside. This is why there were no signs of forced entry and no alarm had been triggered. Once they were inside the house, Eric made his true intentions known. He was there to take all of Karen and Jim's valuables. While Heidi held Karen at knife point in one part of the house, Eric took Jim downstairs to empty the basement safe. It's not exactly clear what happened next, but at some point during this time, Eric stabbed Jim to death. He described it as, quote, getting carried away.
I was involved in killing the Divelbliss.
In what way were you involved?
I'm the one that did it.
You're the one that did what?
The sadness.
Okay. And
What happened? I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I pulled the knife out and just wanted to just run and take their money and leave. And things didn't work out that way. And things got carried away and I ended up hurting them.
okay. And when you say you ended up hurting them, are you stating that you're responsible for the death of both Karen and James?
Yeah.
After returning from the basement alone, Eric went into the bedroom where Heidi was holding Karen. Just like with Jim, he demanded that she open up the safe. Eric claimed that at first Karen complied, but then she tried to fight him. When she did, he brutally stabbed her to death as well.
Grabbed Karen and took her out to the bedroom where she had the money is. And that's when she said during the safe in the closet. In the process of me getting out, she started to fight with me also. And I knocked her down on the floor and she was fighting with her hands.
So you basically the same thing as what occurred with Jim, stabbed her.
While Eric and Heidi initially pled not guilty following their arrests, both of them would change these pleas before facing trial. In October of 2006, Heidi Kidwell was sentenced to 15 years to life after pleading guilty to complicity to commit murder. Eric Hochman, meanwhile, pleaded guilty to 18 different counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, aggravated robbery, tampering with evidence, theft from an elderly person, grand theft, and aggravated burglary. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. According to the most recent available reports, Eric took his own life in his prison cell in 2019. Much to the outrage of Jim and Karen's loved ones, Heidi was granted parole in 2021. As I'm sure all of you are probably aware after sitting through this 40-ish minute video, I'm a man of many words. However, if I had to distill this case down to its purest essence, I would argue that the phrase pure greed is probably the best way to sum it up. Jim and Karen Divelbliss were killed for nothing more than their possessions. A horrible irony when you consider the fact that everything we know about their characters suggests that this was the least valuable thing that they had to offer. Eric Hochman and Heidi Kidwell may have thought that what they were stealing that fateful night was some cash and jewels, but what they took was actually so much more important. They robbed children of loving parents, siblings of a brother and sister, a community of caring neighbors, and most importantly, a couple from getting to experience all of the many happy years left ahead of them that they should have been allowed to enjoy. Sadly, there's one final gut punch to this story, and it's the fact that at least one other life was arguably taken as a result of this crime. And that's Jeremy Moore's. While Jeremy was cleared of any involvement in his parents' murders by investigators, unfortunately, that wasn't the case in the court of public opinion. There were many who believed that he had something to do with the crime, and understandably, this tore him up inside. According to several people close to Jeremy, especially his wife Jody Graff, Jeremy was never the same after losing his mother and Jim. He fell into a vicious cycle of drug abuse, one which tragically claimed his life in 2014. He was just 35 years old. In addition to Jody, he left behind 3 children. Despite all of the tragedy Karen and Jim's family endured, however, It seems that in the years since, they have done their best to keep their memories alive. In an interview, Karen's sister, Linda Schmelzer, said she still wears one of her sister's rings to keep a part of her spirit close every day. Before we wrap up, we just wanted to give a huge shout out to everyone who made it this far into the video. As always, we hope you found today's story interesting and informative. A huge thanks as well to today's sponsor, Scentbird. Don't forget to check out the link in the description below to get 55% off the first month of your subscription. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.